Biology, as most of you would know, is the study of living beings, right? And living things begin, or they are scripted at a very small level, at the molecular level, right? So we actually have genes, going on to molecules which kind of translate upwards, and they go to the cell, to the organ, to the organism, to ecology, and then to society. So it turns out that if I understand how biology works at a very tiny level, I should be able to translate that upwards and go up and up and up, bottoms up, and predict how biology will manifest at higher levels. That is known as the reductionist approach, and a straightforward scientist would think, why not take the reductionist approach to biology? However, it turns out that life throws surprises at you, and life is not that simple. Life is actually non-linear, okay? Life is kind of convoluted. Life is influenced by many external aspects. Life is influenced by the environment. So at the end of it, what you have is, it's not very simple to apply a reductionist approach to biology. So the hierarchy of biology has to be tackled at different levels by different kinds of scientists, okay? However, just to quote Sir Francis Crick from 1966, as you probably know, he was one of the co-discoverers of DNA. He felt that the aim of modern biology is to understand biology in terms of physics and chemistry. And while that's a noble approach, it actually doesn't work, because at each level of biology, you have a plethora of information, and basic scientists such as us, we tend to kind of focus on one bit and generate a lot of data, right? A lot of seemingly disconnected data, and certainly something that doesn't connect up in the hierarchy. So what do we do with all this information? At the end of the day, a structural biologist and an ecologist are probably looking at the same problem at two different angles, but there's no interconnectivity. So what do we do? So the challenge here for is to actually build some kind of integrated frameworks where you can hopefully be able to go from a bottoms up approach all the way up, while connecting all the randomness and the chaos that comes in between, right? So fortunately, what has happened down the line is biological complexity, or the realization of biological complexity, has come with the understanding or the emergence of information theory as well as computer technology, okay? And this has happened in the last 4 to 6 decades, where we understand that the functioning of biology at different levels can actually be tackled with a lot of information processing. So the domain of computational biology is currently in its 4th decade, and it's actually an umbrella effort between many different kinds of people. So a computational biologist could be a mathematician in hiding, could be a computer scientist in hiding, could be a physicist in hiding, such as me. He or she could be a chemist in hiding, and of course a classical biologist by definition, right? So it's people coming from very disparate, seemingly disparate fields, kind of coming under this big giant umbrella and trying to do things which are useful, okay? And this is kind of an emergent science. It's still developing along the way. It's not defined by one domain, and that's why I think young students like you are very lucky, because you are growing up in an era where a lot of interdisciplinary efforts are coming together. But what can it do? What is the scope of computational biology? So with that, I will actually step back and just recall for you some of the current disease challenges that we are facing in this era. So I'm sure there's a 1 in 3 probability that an individual will get cancer. So I'm sure most of you would have probably known somebody who had cancer, and probably somebody who passed away with cancer, which is a little bit sad, right? And also, if you have elderly grandparents, many of them would be probably having dementia by now, and the root cause of that dementia could be a neurological problem, right? So we are dealing with a lot of these problems which are actually going to increase manyfold as the population ages, right? I'm going to take an example of a neurological disease, which is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's affects about 50 million people worldwide right now, about a fifth of them in India. And what's going on is, as people age more, as they live more, the societal and the economic costs of Alzheimer's is going to just blow up. It's going to be tremendous, you know. Having somebody elderly who's demented at home, okay, that you have to actually invest a lot of resources. And the bad part is, it's depressing to know that you don't have a cure for Alzheimer's as of yet. Once you're detected, you just wait out your time till you kind of slowly decay and you disappear, right? So what can we do about it? So I thought I'm going to kind of come to computational biology from a disease perspective. So diseases such as cancer and neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, they are actually multifactorial. And by that, I mean that they don't happen due to one single cause. Rather, they are intertwined genetically, physiologically, morphologically. So you can't really pinpoint one trigger for Alzheimer's or cancer or multiple sclerosis or any of these complex diseases. Which means that it's difficult to predict how a certain disease, what's going to be the progression of a disease, okay? So what can we do about it? What can computational biology do about it, okay? So first, I'll actually touch upon three important touchstones of computational biology. The first one will be the domain of bioinformatics, which many of you have actually probably heard of. Bioinformatics is simply put a processing of information in biology and kind of coming up with transfer of those processes and coming up with mathematical rules for conversion of those processes from one system to the other. So we know that in biology, a unit of information is encoded in the gene, right? And the gene, actually each gene is supposed to translate to a protein, and interplay of these proteins will actually give about the functions of the entire living organism. We human beings have some 20,000 odd genes, but the number of proteins we produce are much, much more. So how is it that just about 20,000 genes can give rise to a number of proteins which are much more, and any alteration at one end can actually, you know, change the effects downstream. Just a case in point, the Human Genome Project, which was completed in 2003 and mapped out all the genes that are responsible for making human beings what we are, was completed at a cost of a few billion US dollars. But now, and largely with the help of bioinformatics, but now the field has gone forward to such an extent that you can actually map out your own genome for the same cost that you would invest for a pair of jeans, okay? Jeans as in your clothes, right? So it's actually really come down manifold. So with that, what can you do? How can you use bioinformatics for a disease such as Alzheimer's? So what was done actually is about 6 years back, a group of scientists tracked down about 74,000 odd individuals from across different parts of European ancestry and did a genome-wide analysis. They mapped out all the genes, looked at the changes or the patterns of changes over the genes, and they identified one particular gene which encodes for a protein which metabolizes fat in our body. And it turns out if you have some changes in that gene or mutations in that gene, you are probably more likely to get Alzheimer's as you grow older, okay, or at least late onset Alzheimer's that elderly people get. So that was actually a big success story, published in a very renowned journal in 2013, but there have been many different studies altogether. So the challenge is to bring all this information together. The second thing that we do is the field of molecular mechanics or multi-scale simulations. So let me explain what that is about. So as I just pointed out, with bioinformatics, you can actually detect proteins which can get changed and affect your propensity to get diseases. Now these proteins are tiny molecules, but however, they're not isolated. They're working with other proteins, and they are the ones that you can target with a drug. So all these medicines that you take in, they're nothing but small molecules designed to interact specifically with one protein, which is identified with a disease. So what molecular mechanics does is treat these tiny proteins, which are probably not more than a nanometer in size, as a physical particle. And if I can estimate the effective force acting on one tiny physical particle due to the other particles, I can understand how it's going to evolve. Now proteins, they turn out to be very dynamic, which means that they are not like a tiny little rock, but rather they have a character of their own. They can fluctuate they can interact with other proteins, yet most proteins tend to maintain some kind of a shape. So shape shifting and dynamic processing in a protein will change its propensity to get into, to trigger a disease or stay stable. So what molecular mechanics does is, look at these proteins, these tiny little entities as single units, design studies where you can put in a drug or another orthogonal protein into it and see how things are evolving over space and time. So I can actually predict how a particular protein responsible for Alzheimer's disease, be it that fat metabolizing protein or another protein specifically, which is a tiny protein called amyloid beta, which actually deposits within the synapses of your brain, I can actually understand what are the triggers which kind of aggregate these proteins. So the field of molecular dynamics is also associated with the field of drug discovery, where we can actually target small molecules or do a matchmaking between small candidate drug molecules and these proteins which have come from which have been translated via genes. Now still, coming back to Alzheimer's, it's one thing to understand that your fat metabolism is linked to your chances of getting Alzheimer's. It is one thing to understand that if you have more amyloid beta between your synapses, you can probably get more of Alzheimer's. But it's another thing to realize, which was done till the late 80s up to the early 90s, is that your brain itself gets changed if you get a disease such as Alzheimer's. That means that diseases can actually change the morphology of an organ. So if you have lung cancer, you will realize that the shape of your lungs, the morphology of your lungs change. If you have multiple sclerosis, the way your nerves are sheathed is going to get changed. If you have Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease, the structure of your brain is going to change. And incidentally, you had no way of knowing this about a few decades back, before there were good imaging techniques and you all actually had to autopsy dead people to understand this. But now we have better technology to actually predict Alzheimer's even by imaging techniques. But that brings us to another domain of computational biology, which is computational neuroscience. And what is it? It is actually understanding how the brain works. Simply said, you can actually build mathematical models or algorithms which will predict how a signal is transmitted via a single neuron. A neuron is kind of a circuit within the brain. It can look at how different neurons come together and network, how they can come together and transmit signals via the network. It can actually also understand the basis for memory and cognition, and it can also nowadays go into the realm of consciousness, where you can actually differentiate between a conscious and an unconscious state depending on the state of your brain. Okay, so all these three domains that I touched upon, they actually rely on algorithms, building different mathematical models, okay, testing them out. Okay, you actually have to test them out on real systems. It's not just sufficient to simulate them or to number crunch. Okay, and you actually have to go back to experimentalists and figure out whether the model that you have developed is actually a valid model or not. Now what helps us, what are the strengths of doing it and what aids us as we develop the domain of computational biology? Now certainly the fact that computer power is growing, okay, and since its inception some decades back, about 6 decades back, that's when the first computers were built, computational power has grown about 6 trillion times, okay. So the power of modern computers is tremendous, okay, and many of you may have heard of Moore's law, where the computational power increases linearly with time. But past 2013, the last 5 to 6 years, we find that Moore's law has also saturated, which means that computational power is actually not growing as fast as we expected as it grew the last few decades. What does that mean? How can we expect computational biology to grow if our number crunching abilities are limited? So that means that you actually have to come up with smarter algorithms, you actually have to come up with smarter ways of doing the mathematics, more efficient algorithms, and you also have to rely on better data that comes from experiments. So in a way, it's a marriage of different kinds of domains. It's kind of a confluence of many different skills which come into the growth of computational biology. Okay, and So as we go along, the final thing that I wanted to point out, there are several subdomains as I pointed out, okay. However, a mistake that I have noticed people doing is they assume that computational biology can be universally applied to all problems. It is not the case, okay. While we are still growing, eventually we will probably have a seamless framework where you can go from one level to the other and go all the way up to the organismal and molecular and the ecological level, but you actually have to realize which tool to apply to which domain. For example, if you are going to do drug discovery, you will probably not apply neurosciences directly. You are probably going to look at things at the molecular level. If you are looking at how metabolism works, you are probably going to invoke a method called systems biology. So given all of that, you actually have to understand what works for which domain, and for that you actually need to go back. It's a feedback mechanism, by which you need to go back to experimentalists, come up with your own models, go back and forth till you achieve what you assume is kind of a seamless tool. So with that, I would only emphasize that it's nothing, this is a domain which probably was not recognized some decades back. But now you can actually have many different people come under the same umbrella and join hands to tackle some of the challenges facing humankind. And this can go as, one of the things we touched upon was disease, but you can also go up to ecological problems. For example, the human genome that not just tells us where we came from, how did we evolve, but what can we expect of the human race maybe a few millennia from now? Which way are we going, okay? And the perturbations that we have owing to society and to the environment, which way are they leading us from our natural trajectory? Admittedly, I have not even managed to scratch the surface of computational biology, but I hope it at least gave you a glimpse of the possibilities of this domain, and perhaps some of you might even be encouraged to actually understand, go into a little bit of more depth and apply your skills to this subdomain. With that, I'll conclude my talk, and I thank you very much for having me here.